All right, chapter 4, how to grow like a leader. In this chapter, in many ways, the key idea, the key theme is that all leaders always have to keep growing. And in this chapter, we identify 4 key areas where leaders have to grow. First, they need to grow in their calling. They need to grow in compassion. They need to grow in communication, and they need to grow in their character. And this brings up this idea, sort of the fuzzy line sometimes between discipleship and the heart and the skills. In many ways, compassion and character, that really speaks to the heart of the leader. You need to grow in compassion toward those who you're leading or those you're serving. And your character, what's going on the inside, the integrity of your heart, like David, that needs to grow. And then there's also skill issues. And in many ways, calling and the specific areas where you're called to lead, there will be skills we need to cultivate. And that often comes from seeking wisdom from advanced leaders, and then communication. And we'll talk about those different ways. And in many ways, some of these themes will reemerge in the later chapters in the book. But this is where they start. Do you have any comments on how to frame that or how to think about that at every stage of leadership?
Yeah, no, I think you hit it on the head there. That, like all leadership issues, there is a heart and there's a skill. And I think we think about the calling. It requires a heart that's growing and being shaped by God, but it also requires a lot of skills. And I think sometimes we take the idea of calling, and it is so mystical because we read about Moses in a burning bush, and we read about these dramatic accounts in the Bible that are real and true, but we skip right over all the other leaders in Scripture who didn't have dramatic encounters like that. And most people tend to have something that's less dramatic and less supernatural and less disruptive as a calling. And I have always felt like the need and the opportunity is the call. And the call was issued once and for all by Jesus: go and make disciples of all nations. And so any opportunity and any invitation and any chance to do that, I always felt like that was not something that I needed an angelic visitation or a voice or a budget in order to do. You just do it. And then in doing that, I stumbled on the specifics, being a church planter in campus ministry in the Philippines. But I did a lot of I walked through just about every door that opened. Some were just a crack. And then when I got there, as I responded the best I could to Jesus' call to go, in one of my goings in 1984, I stumbled into the long-term call, which was to be there and to build there. But I think the best way to find the specifics of the call is to obey the general call, which is the call to go make disciples of all nations. But if we're ignoring the general call and doing nothing, then we're probably never going to figure out the more specifics of the calling.
So when we think about this idea of all leaders need to grow and continue to grow, it's a continuous, lifelong process. Often people think about calling as a one-time event. God calls them, they're in a meeting, they get whether it's a mystical or just a very sort of practical moment, they go, this is what I'm going to do with the rest of my life. And we often forget that even if someone begins on a journey, there's a continuing process of seeking God, a continuing process of gaining advice from wise people and realizing your clarity on your calling and even sort of shifting responsibilities and skills. That's going to continue to be a process. And I even think about your own experience of the last 30, 35 years as a vocational minister. There's a point where you realized it's what you were called to do, but it's changed. It wasn't necessarily what you thought it was when you started a few years ago.
Yeah, and I think that's why we all have to continue to grow. We're talking about how to grow like a leader, and part of that is growing in the understanding of your calling. And I initially felt called to do campus ministry, and that's what I did. But that evolved into planting a church that reached the campus, and then that evolved into not just a church, but a citywide church, and then a nationwide, and it kept evolving. But with each move along the way, it was typically a combination of the people around me pushing me to a new place of ministry. And it was rarely initiated by me. It was usually initiated by those around me. It's important, we talked about earlier about building your team.
Yeah. And listening to your team.
Yeah, and having the team say, you know what, we need you doing this. And oftentimes I had an excuse why I was not the person to do it, someone else should. But the team, the Lord speaking to me through the team is how it usually happened for me.
And when thinking, sort of open up, move on to other areas of growth, when we think about compassion, which is the next thing the chapter attacks, people often think that leaders are motivated ultimately by ambition. Leaders that's the drive, they're ambitious. But in many ways, Jesus' example and the continuing refrain in this book is actually leaders are motivated, biblical and godly leaders are motivated by compassion. The desire to take initiative, the desire to build a team, the desire to take risks. It's all about compassion to serve others, compassion for others and serving others. How can we grow, or how can leaders grow in that area?
I think the more we get around people, especially people who are less fortunate, people who are far from God, people who are hurting, I think our hearts can grow hard and can grow callous and can forget. When we intentionally get around people, then I think the bad thing would be is if our hearts responded as Pharisees and judgmental. But I think what happens to most leaders is we get around and then our hearts soften and compassion starts pouring out, and then creativity, ministry creativity happens because we start now our heart's in the need. And the more you're there, the more you start figuring out what needs to be done, and then the creativity comes. We have to do this, but there's no budget. We'll find the money. And that's how leadership happens, because that compassion triggers a lot of other things in a ministry context.
You know, you were talking about developing that heart of compassion and being out on campus. You know, it can kind of go both ways. Your heart can become hard by just simply by all the need, and you're overwhelmed by it. And so maybe you lose that, and your heart gets hardened. And it could also go the other way, where your heart gets hardened because, man, there's so much need, and your heart is broken so much that you don't think, man, it could ever get fixed. There's no hope. And so I found, like, to find that heart of compassion, it has to be connected to God, who is the source of compassion. So it's like my prayer life. So it's me physically being where lost people are, or where people that are far from Jesus are. I get that refreshing sense of, man, I used to be right there. But then me also getting with God and saying, God, I need your heart for these people. I need to see things the way, and let me pray on their behalf, because some of them, they can't pray for themselves. Some of them, yes, other people are praying for them, but those students aren't able to stand in the gap for their own selves. And so when I am able to kind of pray, that allows my heart to stay compassionate for people that are far from Him. So,
yeah, and I think we all have to find a way to keep a compassionate heart. And as Delvin pointed out, sometimes that's through prayer and the Word. Corporate worship does that. It's hard to keep a calloused heart when we're involved in corporate worship. Doing discipleship and doing life in community does that, because we're challenged by one another. But there is also that going down where hurting humanity lives, and going down where it may not be the focal point of our whole ministry, but finding those hurting people. Whatever it takes for our hearts to continue to grow as leaders with compassion. Typically, our strategic planning meetings don't do that. Our staff meetings, our weekly staff meetings, as important as they are, they don't do that.
Soul crushing.
They probably do the opposite of that. Yeah. And so whatever that does for each individual, we as leaders have to continue growing, not just in our calling, but in compassion, because ultimately we're leading people. Yes, we lead organizations, we lead meetings, but when you boil it all down, leadership is leading people, and that takes compassion.
Why don't we make the slightly awkward transition from the poor and the broken to Instagram? And the next C is communication.
That was smooth.
You talk about there's a connection, and you talk about, and this is really a skill. Clearly there's a heart behind it, but leaders have to grow in communication. It doesn't matter how compassionate or how much character they have, if they can't communicate in a variety of ways effectively and clearly, communicate what's inside to let other people see it and follow the example, it'll be very hard for them to lead. And you tell a funny story here about your first speech Little League, and you froze up, and sort of there's this moment of sort of marking you of terror. You were terrified of public speaking. So how did you have to negotiate that reality that if I want to lead, I'm going to have to learn how to communicate. I'm going to grow as a communicator.
Well, you say, how did I negotiate it? Like all negotiations with God, it's pretty one way. It doesn't really change what he wants. You know, I'll do this, God, if you take that away. Well, he just doesn't respond. So I just had to. And my first few sermons weren't much better than that first Little League baseball speech. They were terrible. And I think if you look at the excuses of Moses, Gideon, Jeremiah, and people who responded, they almost always included their lack of communication skills. And so we've talked about the heart of leading, heart of compassion for people, but then there is a skill of communication. Some people are natural communicators, they're natural speakers, they're just good at it. That was not me. Whatever ability that I have to communicate at any level is by the grace of God and a lot of hard work and intentionality when it comes to learning. I'm right now, Delvin and I are taking a course on biblical preaching. And so I'm in my late 50s and I'm still aggressively trying to upgrade my skills, my preaching skills, my communication skills, my writing skills. And I don't think they're ever good enough. I think the mission, the calling, doing things to represent God demand that we constantly upgrade.
Yeah.
And so I think that's doable. I think communication is maybe one of the most doable parts of growing as a leader.
You talk about blogging and writing, and in some ways you had to, you're not a millennial, but you had to adopt millennial communication forms in order to communicate. You've been blogging for like 15 years, so you're an early adopter with blogging, and there's archives and archives and archives of blogging, and you started Twitter before I did, because I will refuse.
Yeah, but you still don't do it.
I still don't do it. So how did you have to adopt forms to continue communicating effectively, adopt new forms of communication? Because some people, if they don't grow in that area, they may go, well, I write my church bulletin that's printed out and given to everyone on Sunday, and that worked in the 80s, and they're still doing it in 2017, and no one reads it. So how do you recommend people grow and just grin and bear it and be an adapter to all those things I don't like?
That's a good question, and the answer is the familiar answer that I have is that people around me forced me to. I built a team, and that team is mostly younger than me, quite a bit younger than me. And they said, if you want to communicate, here's how you have to do it now to get not necessarily a larger audience, because I was never after just the largest audience possible, but the right audience. Because we're so involved in campus and training future leaders, the people around me forced me to start blogging because the magazine we were doing at the time was not hitting the audience we were after. So we went online. And then, even though I think I wrote some blogs mocking the idea of Twitter, and then they came to me and said, you need to do this to communicate to the right audience we're trying to reach. And then that led to Facebook and Instagram, and I've resisted every one of those every step of the way. So leadership's not just influencing, but it's willing to be influenced by the people around you, and willing to be influenced by the people you lead. I think it's important for leaders to do that, and that's a case in point of my team forcing me to change the way I communicate.
I think though, in a subtle way though, there was also a sense where you were trusting the team. Because even though there was kicking and screaming about it, at the end of the day, you said, okay, I trust you. I still think it's gonna fail, but I trust you, and I'm gonna do this. And I think that's something that we as leaders can communicate. Has there ever been a moment or maybe a particular instance? I was trying to think if you'd written, if there was a story in the book, but I couldn't remember, where somebody came to you with a crazy idea, either for you to do it or for someone else to do something. And you said yes, though you did think it was a crazy idea and maybe did not think it was going to succeed, and you were pleasantly surprised. How did that play out?
Yeah, there's a lot of those, but the biggest one, it might be our building in Manila. that for years, actually, the team pressed me about a building. They brought up the need. They had a long list of prophetic words. They had a long list of why we should do it. And for years, I said, no, we're doing just fine without a building. I don't want to do it. We're doing okay. Who wanted the burden of that? And it was relentless. And I finally, with a terrible attitude, submitted to the team. And I look back now, and I'm very grateful that the 2 buildings we built in Manila, they have been tremendous tools. And that's all a building is. It's not a monument. They're tools for us to more effectively do what God called us to do. But if it had been left to me and my great visionary leadership, those buildings would not exist.
The final area of growth that we talk about in this chapter is character. And often we like to think, well, maybe I can just, with enough willpower and enough desire, sort of pick the right characteristics of a leader and display them at the right times, and we're good. But we all know that's not really how God works in our heart, and that's not how the fruit of the Spirit comes about in our lives. In many ways, you focus on scriptures that talk about suffering, and scriptures that talk about having to persevere, and it's actually the process of persevering. Whether you're leading and things aren't going so well, or perhaps you have a big heart to lead and you aren't having the opportunity, but in those moments of futility or suffering, or seems like you're just going nowhere, that's when God's working on your character, not in the moments on the mountaintop of success. Can you talk more about that and how leaders can grow in different stages of their leadership trajectory and grow in their character? Never neglect that, because that's when things can go really wrong.
Well, there's a couple of verses, and we point them out here in this chapter, but in Proverbs 17:3 it says, the crucible is for silver and the furnace for gold, and the Lord tests the hearts. And so the idea is that God's testing our heart the same way the crucible will test silver, the same way the furnace tests gold, and both of those involve heat. And there's pressure and there's heat. The word character in Scripture comes from the idea of the way a coin was pressed and the way an ancient coin was made, and it involved, again, heat and pressure. And those are things we don't like. When it heats up in our life, whether it's financial or relational or pressure and stress, we don't like that. But it's oftentimes God uses those moments to begin to stamp and forge character, and also to expose character that He doesn't want. And in the scriptures you mentioned, William, in Romans 5:3-4, it says, we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance. Endurance produces character, and character produces hope. And so it says there that the sequence is suffering, and then endurance and character. And so we want the character, but we don't want the suffering. So it's suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character. And so if we want the character, we have to have the suffering.
We're talking about, trials and suffering and growing with ourselves as leaders ourselves. And I'm just wondering, how do we bring others on that journey with us, and how do we, with the students or campus ministers under us, how do we encourage them and bring them with us on this crucible of growth?
I think when I was doing interviews with many of the pastors whose stories and leadership trajectories end up in this book, in many ways they were just told, come along while we do this. So I remember one of the stories, Pastor June, who was a college student or just out of college, he was at every stage, whether it was witnessing to people on campus, whether it was helping set up for a meeting, whether it was speaking at a service, he was sort of brought along, and in many ways in the beginning was just watching. But then he was encouraged to do those things that would help him understand his calling, things that would help him grow in compassion, things that would help him grow as a communicator. All those stages, and in many ways, as leaders, if leaders are growing themselves and intentional about growing in those areas, if they're, again, building a team and bringing others along with them, then that will, in many ways, naturally happen.
Yeah, and I think they can help us develop and identify. We'll talk about it in chapter 6 more about identifying potential leaders, identifying opportunities, identifying callings, identifying open doors. But when we start thinking about growth in calling, compassion, communication skills, and character, it does become a grid for us to start looking for new leaders who have a calling in the particular area, because everybody has a calling, but those who have a calling in the area that we're leading, those who do have compassion for people in that. They might have compassion for the business community and no compassion for the campus, then we don't want them there. Those who have compassion in that area, those who have the ability to communicate, those who have growing character. So I think it becomes a grid that helps us sort through. Again, we'll hit it more in chapter 6 about identification of potential leaders, but I think it can help us figure out who to bring on the journey with us. If their character is stuck or going backwards, I'm not sure I want them on the leadership journey. They probably need some more basic discipleship in some areas, but if the character, they're embracing what God's trying to do, and there's a sense of calling in that area, then no matter how low their skills are, let's get them on the journey. And because their potential, when there's a calling and there's at least a level of embracing God's character development, there's a lot of potential there. There's no telling what God might do if we get them on the journey.